everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Psychology and Policy panel. This event is hosted by the Racial Justice Task Force, which is a subgroup within the USF Psychology Diversity Committee. My name is Elisa Karsten, and I'm a graduate student in clinical psychology, and I'm chair of the Racial Justice Task Force and the Psychology Student Diversity Committee. I'll be co-hosting this panel along with help from Leslie Sawyer and Stephanie Haruza, both also clinical psychology graduate students, and Marcus Cumberbatch, who is an undergrad psychology major, and Valeria Medina Serra, a pre-social work major. As members of the Racial Justice Task Force, part of our mission is to promote civic engagement and encourage involvement with policy-related issues in a nonpartisan way. As students and researchers in psychology and related disciplines, we promote knowledge of psychological processes that have many real-world implications. While we don't always think about it, there are lots of different ways in which the work we do can provide insight into how we go about the process of interacting with policy, and in some cases can directly inform public policies that might have profound impacts on our individual lives, our local communities, and society at large. So the fantastic panelists that have joined us today have been gracious in their willingness to share with us their research findings that speak to current issues in our society that have bearing on how we might respond to others and policies that we might vote on in local, state, and national elections. The purpose of this panel will be to explore a few examples of the ways in which psychology can factor into civic engagement and how we as voters, students, psychologists, researchers, and consumers of research can become more involved with the process. So the upcoming election will likely have a great impact on what we see in our nation and our local communities in the years to come. So we hope the topics discussed today will help you think about the ways in which we can tie together the knowledge we gain inside the classroom and from our research studies with the experiences that we have outside the classroom and university environments to develop new perspectives on civic engagement informed by our backgrounds in psychology. So today's talk will feature two USF psychology faculty members, Drs. Sandra Schneider and Edelyn Verona, as well as one USF alum, Dr. Curtis Puryear. Dr. Puryear will start us off with a talk on the effects of privilege reminders on support for egalitarian policy, followed by a brief Q&A. Then we'll hear from Dr. Schneider on conflicting values and why we often experience deep divides in our judgment about policy-related issues, again with a Q&A afterwards. Finally, Dr. Verona about gun violence prevention and legislation and how it relates to her research in psychology, followed by another Q&A. At the end, we'll upload some voting resources to the chat. So we ask that you hold your questions until the Q&A portion at the end of each talk, at which time you can use the raise hand feature on Teams to indicate that you have a question, and our moderator for each Q&A will call on you. We prefer that you ask your questions verbally by unmuting yourself when we call on you, but if you're unable to use your microphone, you can enter your questions into the chat. This panel is being recorded and it'll be uploaded to our department website. For more information about how to access it, you can contact psychdiversity@usf.edu. Continuing education credits, or CEUs, will also be offered for today's panel. Dr. Vicki Ferris will provide a link in the chat that will enable you to receive your CEU credits. Okay, so without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Puryear.
Thanks, Elisa. All right, let me bring up my screen here. Okay, are you all seeing my slides? I think I started from the wrong. There we go. Does that look correct to everyone?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. I'm used to Zoom, so I don't have the whole gallery view. Okay, so thanks you all for coming out. Today I'm going to be talking about the effects of privilege reminders on support for egalitarian policy. So the idea that some groups have things easier in society should not be a controversial one. It doesn't require that much digging around to realize that if you are born into specific groups, you'll have a greater shot at success.
Curtis?
Yes.
Pause you real quick. You're not in presenter mode.
I am not in. So what are you seeing right now?
Still seeing the edit version.
Okay. You'd think this would be smooth since we just practiced this. Okay. How's that?
Perfect.
Got it? Okay. All right. So let's see. Yeah, so if you are born in specific groups, if you are born into a wealthy family, for instance, you'll have far more opportunities. If you were lucky to have a stable family with two parents who got along, that increased your chances of success. And if you happen to be white, you will not have to deal with obstacles that people of color have to in this country. We have good data for each of these sources of advantage and many more. None should be controversial, but the reality is asking people to acknowledge their advantages often makes them uncomfortable at best and outright hostile at worst. Here are some examples of responses to our privilege awareness activities that we've used. At least on the surface, telling people that they are advantaged often results in denial, resentment, political animosity, and sometimes outright racism. So what is it about reminders of in-group advantage that causes them to evoke these kinds of responses? There are at least two things that every group likes to believe about themselves. The first, that our group has legitimately earned its place in society, and the second, that we are moral and good, that we treat other people well and have an upstanding reputation. In moments of success, calls to check one's privilege undermine feelings of achievement. Convincing people to acknowledge their advantage often feels like giving up credit for success. On top of this, reminders of advantage may suggest that your group's place in society was unfairly earned at the expense of disadvantaged others, meaning that confronting unearned advantages can also feel like a threat to moral standing. These threats are exacerbated by our biases. By default, we typecast people as either all victim or all perpetrator. We are bad at recognizing people as a mix of both. When we view one person or group suffering, it makes it hard for us to imagine how they could possibly do wrong. We blame others less if we have just learned about their suffering, and we doubt the suffering of others we have just learned hurt someone else. So our cognitive templates divide people exclusively into the roles of victim and perpetrator. So if our groups have benefited from the disadvantages of other groups, it makes us feel like we are all perpetrator. Our minds have trouble, at least in the moment, recognizing that this doesn't mean you can't have some disadvantages or be the victim of suffering too, which is related to another psychological shortcoming. When we hear that our in-groups are advantaged, our minds tend to think in terms of categories, not individuals. We hear every person in our in-group is equally advantaged categorically. But of course, wealthy people of color suffer discrimination, and white people are born into poverty. Acknowledging in-group advantage means that your in-group may have more on average, but it shouldn't deny anyone's lived experiences with disadvantage, although psychologically it may often feel like it does. So this puts us in a bit of a conundrum. On the one hand, if we hope to make society an equitable place where everyone has opportunities to succeed, we need to be able to acknowledge where group advantages lie. However, broaching the topic of in-group advantage is often met with resistance. So how do we get advantaged groups to address inequality that stems from group-based advantages? So here are two approaches that are on opposite ends of the spectrum. The first is a book by Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility, that has drawn ire from among some white people. Her approach doesn't really pull any punches. Not only does it say you have all of these advantages, but it goes a step further and claims that these advantages have made you a fragile person. But of course, the argument is that acknowledging advantages should be an uncomfortable process. It should not be easy. Getting to the root of the problem requires acknowledging some uncomfortable truths for advantaged groups. Conversely, Sanders' rhetoric tends to shy away from race and focuses primarily on economic inequality. Now, I can't say whether this is a conscious strategy on Bernie Sanders' part or not, but the fact is, doing what Sanders is doing here is less threatening to most white people than what DiAngelo is doing. By focusing on economic inequality, Sanders creates a more inclusive frame because most groups suffer from economic hardship, which makes it easier for advantaged groups to not feel typecast as an exclusive oppressor. It is possible that by focusing on economic inequality, you may succeed in gathering the support of a broader group of people to enact social change that reduces inequality. Of course, the problem with this approach is that it may cause people to ignore entirely important issues that require acknowledging the role of race. For example, focusing on economic inequality may motivate people to support safety net spending and affordable health care, things that will likely help reduce racial inequality. But other issues like racial bias in policing are impossible to tackle without acknowledging the advantages of white people specifically. So you might succeed in garnering support for egalitarianism in a broad sense, but fail to address issues that are inseparable from race. So our goal was to test these trade-offs. We used several types of interventions that vary the degrees that explicitly call out white advantage to see how this affected threat and support for egalitarian policy. These are some materials from our interventions that illustrate the different framing strategies. So the first picture explicitly mentions white privilege, which is represented by the balloons. The second intervention discusses racial inequality by referencing Black disadvantage, illustrated by weights. Importantly, the materials of both of these first two interventions focused on race explicitly from the beginning, whereas the last frame, however, focused on economic issues and gave white people the opportunity to acknowledge some of their possible disadvantages while making it clear that white people have less weighing them down on average. We called this the inclusive victimhood condition because psychologically we predicted this would help people to not see themselves typecast as perpetrators of harm. So we predicted that the white privilege frame would evoke the most threat, the disadvantage frame a little bit less, and the inclusive frame the least. We also predicted that everyone would not respond to these activities in the same way. Usually when people are confronted with their advantages, they respond in one of three ways. They deny it, they distance themselves from the advantage group identity, or they try to change the world. The last two strategies are ways of dealing with the threats of advantage while still acknowledging their existence. You can say, yes, white people are advantaged, even oppressive, but I'm not like most white people. You could also say, yes, white people are advantaged, but I'm actively doing things to try to change that. In both of these situations, acknowledging in-group advantage shouldn't be that threatening anymore. You found ways to reconcile the threat more or less. However, people who deny racism altogether, the existence of white advantage should still be threatening to their identities. So we are especially interested in the results among people low on perceived racism. Specifically, we had two open questions here. The first raises the question of whether the inclusive victimhood conditions increase broad egalitarianism support at a cost to support for policies specifically tied to race. Second, some researchers found that diversity trainings produce unintended backlash effects, so we also wanted to examine whether threat undermines support for egalitarianism. So our first study had 500 white Americans recruited from MTurk, assigned to one of four conditions. At the beginning of the study, they answered our scale for perceived racism, which was our moderator. They were then assigned to one of our four different advantage framings, the three that I mentioned briefly, which I'll talk a little bit about more in a second, and a fourth control activity where they just read about historical facts. We then asked them how they felt about the activity, and then measured policy attitudes. Here are some example items for how we measured perceived racism. We used the symbolic racism scale, which has items like how much discrimination against Black people do you feel there is in the United States today, limiting their chances to get ahead. And then the meat of the activity used a common privilege exercise called privilege lists. And on each page of this activity, you read an item that's an example of white privilege or Black disadvantaged in those two conditions. And the items were the same in the privilege and the disadvantage conditions, but the wording was just changed to match the disadvantage or the privilege frame. The inclusive victim condition was a little bit different. That included items like that affected groups more broadly, like inheritances and living in low-income areas and things like that. They then received this feedback that I showed you a few slides back. Importantly, participants received the same type of feedback regardless of how they responded to the privilege list exercise. And then there was actually an extra page where they reflected on the activity a little bit. And then we gave them some extra information about racial inequality in America. So in this first study, we actually explicitly mentioned race across all conditions, but the framing differed a little bit before the message about racial inequality. And after our intervention, we measured how people felt about it, the extent that they found it threatening. Again, this threat measure, there were 4 different, I think there were 8 items total. Asked about these 2 different dimensions of what groups like to believe themselves about themselves that I mentioned earlier, being good and being legitimately or having legitimately earned your place in society. And then we also asked about guilt. And for our policy attitude measures, we asked about support for government spending on safety net programs like food stamps. And then we also asked about support for affirmative action policies. We had a few additional exploratory measures, looking at things like zero-sum beliefs, like when racial minorities, the belief that when racial minorities get rights, they come at the cost to white people, perceptions of anti-white bias, and we also looked at whether any of these interventions made Trump more appealing. So looking at the results for threat, on the low racism side of this plot, it's actually the people who perceive high degrees of racism. And among these people that acknowledge the existence of racism, none of our interventions induced any threat relative to this, compared to this historical trivia exercise. But among people who deny the existence of racism, who scored high on the symbolic racism measure, they induced quite a lot of threat. And on top of that, we saw the gradient that we predicted with the white privilege framing inducing the most threat, and the disadvantage, and it's labeled affirmation here because we've changed our terminology a little bit over the course of this project, but that is the inclusive victimhood frame, being somewhere in the middle. Among people who acknowledge the existence of racism, we also saw increases in guilt. In the disadvantage and privilege frame, we didn't see any changes relative to control among people who deny the existence of racism. Now looking at whether this translates into actual changes in policy support. Looking across all participants, so these are the unmoderated results collapsing across all participants high and low on our perceived racism measure. We do not see a whole lot of movement. Maybe see a little increase on support for safety net spending in all 3 of our conditions, but those just trended aren't quite significant. However, when we break it down, again, by high symbolic racism and low symbolic racism, here's a summary of all of our different measures. And I've highlighted here where we do see some evidence for diverging responses at high and low levels of symbolic racism. Looking at support for affirmative action, the privilege condition specifically increased opposition. But for people low on symbolic racism, we see increases in support for safety net spending. But looking at everything together, if we look at our other exploratory measures, you can see that the results tend to be small. The effects tend to be on the small side and inconsistent, though there is maybe some suggestive evidence of diverging responses to these activities in terms of policy support at high and low levels of symbolic racism. And it's also important to note we have our other 2, the privilege versus control contrast is the only area we saw effects on any of these variables. So to summarize, at least explicitly, people who deny racism say they find privilege threatening. More so than other framings of inequality. Further, there was some evidence that this threat translates into diverging attitudes towards social policy, but looking across everything we measured, effects were somewhat small and inconsistent. Okay. So for study 2, we simplified the intervention a bit to more precisely manipulate things. We had 2 conditions that exclusively focused on economic inequality and 2 that focused on race this time. We also had 2 conditions that used disadvantaged language and 2 that used privileged language. So we had a fully cross design in this study. We also cut out the false feedback and the additional information at the end to give us a cleaner look at exactly what we were manipulating. And we also increased additional attitudinal measures of support for each type of egalitarianism. So we still had privilege interventions that were framed around Black disadvantage and white privilege. These were pretty similar to the first study. And we also had these 2 other interventions that were framed strictly around economic privileges and disadvantages. So these are the examples of the first page people see when they open up the intervention. And it's also important to note the way that we framed this was we told participants that these were privilege exercises that we used with our students at USF. And these are our new measures for egalitarianism, trying to get a more fine-tuned look again at support for general versus race-based egalitarian attitudes. So that's why we added these in here. Now let's look at the results. And at this point, you'll notice that between collecting these two studies was the point in my career that I learned R. So note that we also use a slightly different measure of perceived racism in this study. So the high perceived racism is on the left now, or it was on the left before too, but I think it was labeled symbolic racism. Okay, but these results are pretty similar to that of the first study. When you look at low perceived racism, people that deny the existence of racism, we see a lot more threat, and that threat tends to be highest in the white privilege condition, people saying they feel attacked by the exercise. We see some small increases in threat or trending increases in threat among high perceived racism, but none of those are significant. Looking at our results on our new egalitarianism measures, we don't see very much movement at people who acknowledge the existence of racism. I mean, a slight trending increase there for the general egalitarianism and the Black disadvantage condition, but it's just trending. It's a marginal effect. We do see effects for low perceived racism, and it tends to be a little bit stronger in the Black disadvantage condition compared to white privilege. But notice that at least for general egalitarianism, but for race-based egalitarianism, both Black disadvantage and the white privilege frames both tended to equally increase support for race-based egalitarianism among people who deny the existence of racism. So this is quite an interesting finding. And it's also interesting the economic frames did nothing, not even for general egalitarianism. We don't see any movement on that framing. Looking at our previously used measures, we don't see some smallish effects for support for safety net spending, but a pretty decently sized effect for affirmative action support. And notice that this is in the opposite direction as we saw in study one. In study one, we saw actually a backlash effect on affirmative action support. Here we find that it's the white privilege framing, the one that induces the highest amount of threat in our sample, also is the best at increasing affirmative action support among people who deny the existence of racism. So this is some evidence for the threatening interventions are maybe important. Reveling in that discomfort is maybe an important element for increasing affirmative action support. But again, our results are conflicting here across our two studies. So limitations, it would be nice to look at these effects over time. We're only able to look at the immediate effects of these interventions, but some of the mechanisms at play here might be something that happens when you're exposed to this language repeatedly over time. But we still see some interesting effects, even just looking at the immediate effects of our interventions. It would also be nice to use maybe more vivid interventions. These were modeled after real world interventions that universities use and are also on websites. But some studies have found larger effects for more vivid interventions. Other studies have looked at things like privilege walks, which are a bit more engaged activities. I've used audio-visual content, which might give you a better chance of getting slightly larger effects here. And it's also important to note that the interventions here are structured and they might be quite different from what happens when you use privilege or disadvantaged language in an actual conversation with someone, either face-to-face or on Twitter. But they do demonstrate how people tend to respond to these reminders, at least in a structured setting. But it would be nice to move beyond the structured environment to see how things actually happen in real-world conversations. But again, these interventions tools are useful and people use them. It's also worth noting that these two studies took place in different contexts. So one of the possible reasons why we see a very different effect on support for affirmative action across the two studies, where in study 1, we get a backlash effect among people low on perceived racism. But in study 2, it's actually the most threatening condition, the white privilege condition, that does the best at increasing support for affirmative action. But these two studies took place before and after the George Floyd protests, so maybe the cultural mindset was a bit different and people are more open to issues of race post George Floyd, which was the case after when we collected study 2. Okay, but in sum, for people who doubt the existence of racism, yes, reminders of race-based advantages do induce threat. But the question is whether that's part of the process, whether that's an important element for bringing people into supporting egalitarian policy, and we had mixed results on that front. There's some evidence of backlash, but study 2 found more consistent results that using the conditions that induce some degree of threat is necessary to increase any movement towards policy attitudes, because again, we found no effects at all upon any type of egalitarian policy support when we just frame things in terms of economic issues. And the second question is maybe timing, what context, how open people are in the current context might affect which direction this effect goes. So when talking about social policy, mentioning race at least seems to make a difference. It seems to be an important element, at least for how you structure these kinds of interventions. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much for that informative talk, Curtis. Dr. Puryear, we really appreciate your time. And now we're going to open up for questions. So if you'd please use the raise hand feature, we can call on you that way. Thank you. Ansley, I see your hand is up.
Yes, thank you. So one question I had is, how was the perceived racism measure, like how did that operationalize racism? Was that more at, it seemed like it was more at the structural level in terms of like policies and discrimination and things like that. Was there any about like individual attitudes, individual racial stuff, or what was that?
Yeah, so they actually differed across our two studies. In the first study, it was more general questions. The symbolic racism scale contains more general questions about your just belief about the prevalence of racism in society and the degree that groups are still, that Black people still face discrimination, items like that. But there are a few more items in the symbolic racism scale that get more at resentment. And so for study 2, we used a different measure to make sure that we were actually capturing perceptions of racism. And so study 2 actually used items that were a little bit more like short vignettes. So the items asked things like, imagine X person who's a Black American is, I think one of the items, they're going to look at houses and the real estate person only takes them to houses in low income areas. Is this an example? How much did racial prejudice influence what the realtor did? And people say it was 100% due to racism or it was not at all due to racism, right? So the items in our second study that looked at perceived racism measured it in that way.
Cool.
We have some time definitely for questions if there are others. And if there are no questions, we also can take a short break until, oh, look, Marcus has a question. See, you never want to end too soon.
Yeah, one particular question. I know you mentioned, Dr. Puryear, that one of the limitations was trying to study these effects over time. Do you have plans in your future research or in your current research to study those effects, or how does this study affect your current research?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of different directions. One of those is, yeah, I think doing the longitudinal work would be very interesting and important. That's probably a different paper than this set of studies. The other work I think we're focused on doing more immediately is stuff that gets at more real-world conversations we've been collecting. We have like 10 million tweets that happened occurred during June and July with the hashtag Black Lives Matter. So we are looking at conversations that took place in that context to give us maybe to see how people respond to each other when they use language that focuses on privilege versus disadvantage and how that affects real world conversations, for example. So that's probably the most immediate work we're following up this with now. And I had hoped to have some of those tweets, some of the pilot data from those tweets available, but they just weren't quite ready for prime time today yet, unfortunately.
No problem. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
We also welcome your comments or reactions if people have anything else that they'd like to add. I say we as if I'm the one who just gave the talk. I'm hoping that that's agreeable.
I think I see one hand raised, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm David Robertson, part of the psych faculty here. I'm part of a reading group with the Atlee. We're reading a book, Teaching About Race and Racism by Kernahan. And one of the principles there, that really sits with me as somebody who teaches, psychological science is instead of having the goal of changing what they believe when we're teaching students is to change how they think, give them tools, let them reason from data as opposed to feelings and things like that. Not that feelings aren't important, but I wonder, so I don't know if I have a question about it, but instead of changing beliefs, is there a way to measure like how they're thinking as opposed to what they believe? How might you approach that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because you could imagine maybe another thing to look at is like defensiveness, whether people are even like willing to engage with these ideas or just dismiss them outright would be another interesting thing to look at. So maybe even if this happens a lot with like political conversations, right? Where sometimes you maybe don't stand a very good chance of changing people's deep-seated moral convictions about politics, right? And sometimes it's progress just if you can have a conversation, period, right? Sometimes that's all we want to do when we go home for Thanksgiving with our relatives, is be able to actually talk about these things without wanting to kill each other, right? And so a similar thing might be true here. It would be nice if, even if we can't, like, it's hard to change people's minds, at least immediately, especially with like a short one-time intervention. I imagine it's hard to change people's long-standing attitudes, and probably why we get small effects on policy support here. If we can show that people are willing, if we can get people to engage more with these ideas and to be more open to them, I think you're exactly right. That would be something, a cool finding and worth looking into. All right. Okay, Elisa, I see a hand.
Yeah, so I believe the Trump administration recently banned some sort of diversity trainings. I'm wondering if you know anything about that and how it relates to what you presented on today.
Yeah, so those trainings explicitly mention privilege. The trainings that I read the report, I think, when it first came out of the executive order. But yeah, the Trump administration, I think it was an executive order, banned trainings based on critical race theory, I think like government institution or in government jobs or something like that. And on the list, like they explicitly mentioned curriculums that mentioned white privilege. So yeah, these findings are very important for the implications of that, right? Because we need to know whether that type of language is something that's like an important part of the process for getting people to really understanding these, for not just like, I don't know, like there's a sense in which you could understand some of these conditions and the interventions as like sugarcoating things or going easy on whites or something like that, where it's the extent that that could be counterproductive and where it really is important not to do that. Some of the results here, especially in study 2, point to that being the case. And that maybe the idea like for banning that type of language is a bad idea. We might need to use that kind of language to really help people understand these issues and to, yeah. That's my take, I think.
Thanks.
See a question from Julia.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. All right. So my question for you, Dr. Puryear, you talked a little bit about how this general process might apply to other sorts of framings where people might be threatened by privilege. Do you think what do you think about extrapolating some of your results to other things like male privilege, or even when you were talking earlier about like Senator Sanders and how he frames like income inequality and such?
Yeah, so we've actually collected some data for male privilege also, and the patterns looked very like the design was very similar to the design of study 1, and the results were almost identical for male privilege as for white privilege. And I think that's what we would expect. I think the psychology is the same. I think the variable that maybe matters is, again, when I talked about the moderator, our measure, why we measured perceived racism and why we expected things to differ across high and low levels, is things like the extent that people identify really strongly as like a man or a white person, where it's like that's a core part of your identity, then there's going to be more of a chance that you'll be threatened by these things, right? But to the extent the psychology of identification with both of those and how those group identities functions should all be similar, and the threat should play out the same way for people that highly identify with each of those groups. Right. Okay, any other questions? All right, these have all been great questions. And how much time do we have left?
We have about 5 minutes.
Oh, 5 minutes, okay. I'm happy to stand here awkwardly for 5 more minutes if we want.
That's an option. Valeria, you have a question?
Okay, now I'm unmuted. So I'm not sure if you mentioned it specifically, but did you, for the studies, did you mainly focus on, like, I'm trying to like word my question in my head. Did you mostly focus on perceived attitudes with obviously white people, but only African Americans, or did you look at other minorities? Or would you, or if you didn't, if in the future, would you consider looking at different minorities?
Yeah. We had some additional measures in study 2 about perceived power, about how and perceived inequality. So we had one item that like had people ranked different groups, another that had people like say, how much power in society do you think this group has? And we asked about white Americans, Black Americans, Latinos, and a few other groups, I think. And we found almost no effects on any of those variables, though, at least based on this intervention, we didn't really see any movement on those. But yeah, it would be interesting if threatening people's identities has broader effects on people's attitudes towards all outgroups, right? not just the one specific to the activity. That could be something that happens, that people, when they're threatened, they just become defensive and just more prejudiced generally. But again, what we kind of tended to find in study 2 is that threat didn't translate into prejudice at all. In fact, it looked like it tended to translate into increased support for egalitarianism.
Okay, so the option still stands for you to stand awkwardly for 4 minutes, unless there are other questions, which we're happy to offer that. Otherwise, we could take a few minute break until 3:45, at which time we'd like y'all to please join us back for our next speaker. And thank you so much for a very informative talk. We really appreciate you joining us today.
All right, thanks y'all so much for having me.
Okay, so brief break till 3:45. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Next, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Sandra Schneider, whose talk is titled, "Why Can't We Agree? Conflicting Values of What is Good." I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Schneider. Thank you.
Well, hi, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to join you, and thank you all for coming. I am a cognitive psychologist, and I work in the area of reasoning and decision making. And so when you're in this area, you have to be concerned about things like impressions, judgments, opinions, beliefs, values, and issues about what is good is ubiquitous throughout. Good and bad is everywhere. Defining what is good and bad, however, varies because of many different influences. What I want to do today is just talk about 5 of them. And I'm going to breeze through them fairly quickly, I know. So it's going to be a mad dash, but let's start with information framing. And a perfect segue from Dr. Puryear's talk, he was showing some of the influences of framing. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about influences that we've observed in our lab and in other contexts. So a while back, one of my favorite studies was a study that we did about a USF campus news radio broadcast. Now, this was not a real broadcast, but we told our participants that they were listening to a news show that we were hoping maybe would be adopted for actual broadcast. And they thought their job was just to listen to the news stories and determine whether they thought people would be interested in this kind of a radio broadcast. What they didn't know is we were framing the news stories. So we gave some of the stories a positive spin and some of the stories a negative spin. And what I mean by that is that we talked about the story as though this was a good thing that was going to be happening or a not so good thing that was going to be happening. So here are the 4 topics that we looked at. And we tried to do things that we thought people would be interested in. So we looked at things like textbook prices, parking, commons areas, and campus crime. And the stories that we invented were all stories that were designed to sound realistic, although they were not actually true things that were happening. But some of the stories were pitched in a good way and some in a bad way. Now, we worked really hard to make sure that we kept all the facts the same. And all we did was that we changed the descriptors around those facts. So for instance, for textbook prices, we talked about the fact that in the condition that was positively framed, that you would get a full 8% discount on the price of your books for the semester, and that would save you more than $10. When that same exact reduction was described in a more negative way, we said that it was only an 8% discount, and that would be less than $15. Now, I did the intonation, but the broadcaster who actually did this, Suzanne Lorien, was in the mass communications department at the time, and she was very careful. She spliced all this stuff in to make sure that her intonation and everything was precisely the same throughout. So regardless of whether it was a good or bad story. So, or I should say a positive or negative story, really. My favorite, though, was the Campus Commons improvement, where we suggested that there was going to be a new deck that was going in. And when it was framed positively, it was described as an expansive rustic deck with tables intimately arranged. And when it was negatively framed, it was an oversized gray deck with tables crowded together. And so you can see that taking the exact same situation can be depicted in very different ways. And of course, we expected that those things, even though it was just an incidental evaluation, that the way the stories were presented would have an impact on what people came to judge as being a good thing or a bad thing to do. So here's the results. And what you see is that in all cases, the lighter bar, which is where it was framed in a positive way, whatever the story was, that in all cases, the evaluations of whether people were in favor of whatever this thing was or they were unhappy with it, we see very large framing effects. And they're especially large when it involves situations that they weren't aware of in advance. Like textbook price reductions, yeah, that may happen. But like a parking lottery, who knows about that? A commons improvement, well, we saw that we could make people be feel very good about the situation when it's framed positively, but when framed negatively, something that presumably would allow at least a few more people to get more parking or would have more spaces for people to hang out, they were not seen as especially favorable. And when it came to campus crime, we even reversed people's feelings about whether not reversed them, but made the people who listened to a positive story more apt to say that they thought crime on campus was in a good place. Whereas when we framed things negatively, although that's a weak effect, people were more likely to be on the negative side in their evaluations. Now, that's local events and happenings, but there are just so many studies that have looked at real world situations and real world framings of various different kinds of events. They might be things like immigrant integration here, or it might be things like trade deals, climate change. There are any number of things where you can find that when the information is framed in a positive way, people end up being more likely to have a more positive attitude. It doesn't always shift it completely from positive to negative, but it will usually nudge it in a particular direction. And so what that means is that because framing is ubiquitous, I say it's ubiquitous because you really can't communicate without framing, that it's very rare that we can say things in a completely objective fashion. Our language is built with all of these different subtleties that communicate various things. And so we routinely are apt to be influenced, and we are not always aware of the subtleties of language, so that our attitudes, opinions, and the assumptions that we make can be influenced. This tendency is accentuated when the topics are unfamiliar. So if we know something really well, we may be less likely to be influenced. But if we don't, the first impression based on what we hear may have a larger impact. These effects, as I said, are sensitive to pre-existing views, and although framing can offer a pro or con spin, they can also offer many other types of persuasive content, and it may not even be intentionally persuasive. I love it. Thank you, Curtis, because I think that the examples from his talk show how different ways of thinking about what the issues are can have an impact on what you think, and therefore what you feel is good. If different people encounter different frames, their views can be pushed in opposite directions. A second influence: opposing counterfactuals. What's a counterfactual? Well, a counterfactual is thinking about what could have been. So when events happen, we often think about, how could it have gone differently? So an example, I'm going to use an example from a study where there's a situation that's described where a golfer dies because he's hit by lightning when he's at a golf resort. And so the question is, what could have avoided that event? And so we could think about it as, what on earth was that golfer doing when they saw that it was terrible weather? Why didn't they get the heck out of there? Another way we could think about it is, what was the matter with that country club? Why didn't they have a system in place that would get a golfer off the course when it's so dangerous? And so counterfactuals provide the ideas to us for what could have occurred that would have allowed things to happen differently. It's a causal hypothesis. Showing how much of a difference this can make is something that was done in this study using this example. They presented information, an actual 3-hour trial simulation that participants viewed, in which a family was suing this golf club because their family member died. They were requesting $1.2 million in compensation. The participants heard the entire trial as jurors, and of course it was mock jurors, and at the end, even though they heard both pros and cons, they completed a counterfactual where they said, if only, and then the participant had to fill in the blank in terms of their thinking about how to make sense of this case. Then they were asked to recommend compensation amounts for the family. I bet you can guess where this is going. Okay, so if people had counterfactuals that made the golfer more responsible, that said, well, if only he'd been smart enough to get off the course, the average amount they were willing to give to the family was about $17,000. On the other hand, if they felt that it was the golf course who should have done something differently, they gave almost $1 million on average. So we see that, and again, this is a mock-up. It's not necessarily what would happen in reality. There would be a lot of discussion between jurors, etc. But we can see that this way of thinking about what the causes are and what might be responsible can lead to very different interpretations of what the truth of a situation is or how it ought to be looked at. And it can have large behavioral ramifications as well. So different attributions of cause can lead to highly discrepant judgments of what would be a reasonable response to a given event. Another area, motivated reasoning. Now, this is a huge area, so I want to fly through just a couple of examples of studies that have been done. The one that is probably the one that kind of some people say is kind of the start of this area is a study that was done way back in the 1950s when Dartmouth and Princeton students watched a football game, and they're, of course, rivals. And then they were asked questions about what had happened in the game. And so when asked to evaluate the Dartmouth team, which it was a very rough game, apparently, the Dartmouth students reported that the Dartmouth team had some infractions, but not that many. And of course, the Princeton students thought, whoa, that Dartmouth team, they had tons of infractions. And so this is a great example of how we tend to interpret information consistent with, you know, the groups that we favor, and we give them the benefit of the doubt that we don't give to others. But giving that benefit of the doubt, it colors our entire interpretation, and that also then colors our memory, because if they remember these number of infractions, they will hold this information later, and that will be their truth, so to speak. And so, of course, if we have different allegiances, it can lead to very different thoughts and actually different experiences of what's happening. Another example that I like to have people look at is just this right here. So there were several students who did not want to have to write essays on exams. They were in a study where they either heard about a survey that was done where the consensus was that we shouldn't have essays on exams. And when that group was asked how they felt about the quality of the survey, they were like, yeah, good survey, very nice. When instead the results of the survey was, no, it's a good thing to have essays on exams. They were like, that was not that good of a survey. So here we have source evaluation that is contingent on what we believe, and particularly if we are threatened by the thought of, oh no, if that survey means we have to do essays, I'm in trouble. So, and I'm embellishing just a little bit here. I'm not sure that's exactly what the authors would say about precisely what this means, but I think you get the idea that we have a tendency to be more likely to accept the credibility of a source when what we learn is consistent with what we believe. This is probably too much to go through right now, but I just wanted to give another example that has to do with something that I think a lot of us may care about, and that's climate change. This is also a situation where if you take people who don't really believe very much in climate change and you give them information that either says, oh, good news, the climate is not going to be as bad off as we thought, they will incorporate that information in their next judgments. But when it's bad news and it's like, uh-oh, it's going to be an even bigger climate change than we realized, they tend to ignore that information and not use it at all in their later estimates. When we have a situation where people are high believers in climate change, we find the reverse pattern, that when they're told that, it's better than we thought, they're reluctant to really use that information. But when it's, it's even worse than we thought, they're like, oh, I was afraid of that, and they use that information and they incorporate it into their own estimates about how likely the situation is to be better or worse than what was previously anticipated. So motivated reasoning, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, but the bottom line is we interpret and remember information with an overemphasis on confirming and supportive information. We question and discount arguments and evidence if they go against our beliefs, but we're very ready to accept information that is consistent, and we don't really do a good job of checking into source credibility. Our liking of it is probably as important as an actual evaluation of the credibility. Of course, if we have different beliefs to begin with, this, of course, will push us far apart. Confirmatory silos. Continuing on with motivated reasoning, you might say that, well, even if we do motivated reasoning, so long as we're exposed to enough stuff, maybe that will help balance out any tendency that we have to be biased. But actually, do we get exposed to different positions? More and more, it looks like the answer may be no. That it's more, we find more often, especially with the way that social media and search engines are working these days, that we tend to exist in more or less confirmatory silos or bubbles. So one example of this is a study that was done by Yeager and Hahn, where they took captions from news messages and they randomly assigned them to be, well, for some people they saw it as from Fox, from others they saw it as being from CNN or NPR, and for others they saw that same exact story but with no source information. And this was a study where they had several opportunities to select from different things that they might read, and what you find is that people who identified as Democrats were much more likely to be interested in the stories if they were labeled as coming from CNN or NPR. Independents, so here's one little spot of good news, they were more even in their willingness to and interest in reading various articles, and Republicans were very interested in reading Fox and very not so interested in reading stories that had the CNN or NPR labels. So as Yeager and Hahn point out, the very same news stories on crime or Iraq or politics or racial issues attracts a different audience when labeled as a Fox, CNN, or an NPR report. Since March of this year, students in my lab, and Marcus is going to be surprised by this because I'm actually presenting some of our results, were asked about diagnostic tests, including tests about COVID. And I'm not going to talk about those tests, but I'm going to talk about later information that they provided, where they told us about their attitudes towards COVID, their related behaviors, and the information sources where they got their news. We found the same thing that Yeager and Hahn did. Now, these gray lines are people who said, I don't pay attention to any of those sources of news. These folks were more apt to say that they paid attention to things like family and friends, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And we did not find differences across liberal, intermediate, and conservative when these were the news sources. But let's think about it. If you listen to family and friends and Facebook and Twitter, what are the odds that you're still in a confirmatory silo? We can't say, but if the people you choose to converse with and banter ideas around with have ideas similar to your own, you still may be in that silo. What we find here for liberals is that there's very little interest in paying any attention to Fox, lots of interest in paying attention to what I call the liberal outlets, which would be CNN, NPR, and MSNBC in this case. At least more liberal. I'm not saying it's all for sure, but at any rate, in intermediate, we see that people who are saying who are intermediate, they look more like our liberal faction. So this, it makes us aware this is an undergraduate population, and so this might be understandable. Those who identified as more conservative were much more interested in watching Fox than in, or they say they got their news from watching Fox, excuse me, much more so than CNN or NPR. So people who have liberal outlooks lean to liberal media. Conservative outlooks lean to conservative media. So what difference does it make? Well, these are correlational data, so I can't say anything about cause here, but I can tell you the people who report to get their news in terms of the cable news that they watch, if the only thing they watch is Fox, they are much less likely to report that they are worried about COVID. If they only get their information from the CNN, NPR, and MSNBC, they are much more likely to say that they are worried that themselves or someone that they care about might come down with COVID. Well, how about behavior? Does it have, well, we see that those people who pay attention to only Fox are also less likely to report high-frequency protective behaviors. This scale is an amalgamation of several things like distancing, mask wearing, etc. And those who are looking more towards the liberal sources, or at least having some liberal sources, they are more likely to say that they are more commonly engaging in these protective behaviors when they're in social situations outside the home. So we see that even though it's correlational, it still all seems to go together into this confirmatory siloing pattern. And so the issue with this confirmatory pattern is that we get a recursive reinforcement of a single kind of way of looking at the world, and we're less aware and exposed to other points of view. So even if we start with people who are not that far apart, over time, if we have all this motivated reasoning and confirmatory siloing, people can push even further apart. Okay, my last one. Confidence knowledge disconnect. The reason this is really important is that we now have gotten to a place where, okay, so people are in their confirmatory silos often. They may have big disagreements with other people, and at least hopefully we should be able to get the experts in to straighten us out. And of course, there's a big disconnect there. Here we have the classic Dunning-Kruger effect. And the way this works is that the people who perform the worst, in this case on a test, right, and we look at the people who were intermediate and then the people who did really well on the test. We look and see how well do they think they did relative to everybody else. And what you'll find is everybody says they did better than average. Everybody, well, better than the median anyway. Everybody says, whoops, excuse me, that they did better than at least half of the people, and they're wrong. Now, some people say that those who know the least are the highest in confidence. Often there's problems in the way people measure the Dunning-Kruger effect. But what is definitely true is that we are not well calibrated in our confidence. We don't really know how confident we should be in our accuracy, though that doesn't stop us from feeling confident. There's a very interesting study that actually did a good measurement of how you figure out whether people are really overconfident or not. These people were asked about their autism knowledge and autism misperceptions based on information that is put out by the National Autism Society. And what we find is that people who know the least, they got the most questions wrong about autism, are also the most overconfident. How is overconfident measured? It was measured by your willingness to say that you are smarter than the experts, you know more than the experts or the scientists about the relationship between autism and vaccines. And so we find that 60% of the people who got almost nothing correct feel that they know more than the experts. And of course, when you actually do know more, maybe you rightly have the humility to say that, well, experts and scientists know more than I do. This also goes with misperceptions, so that the more you say stuff that is wrong, so if you're high in saying stuff that is just wrong and there's no evidence to support it, the more likely you are to say that you know more than the experts and scientists. So this is pretty frightening, but what it definitely tells us, oh, and here's another thing that's even more frightening, it definitely tells us don't go with confidence as a metric of what you know. The other thing is, the thing that really tends to give you confidence more than anything else is how familiar you feel with the information. So this is scary because of something called the truth illusion. And that is, the more often you hear something, regardless of whether it's true or false, the more likely you are to come to believe that it's true. These are data that show that whether the information was true or false, people will be willing to say, at least in many cases, that even false information is true. Here's the deal. In the blue groups, people were told ahead of time which source was the source that was going to tell you lies and which was going to tell you the truth. Even though they knew that, they did some discriminating, but not much. The group that's in the green bars, they were only told afterwards which of the two sources that they were hearing from was likely to tell the truth and which was likely to be lying. There's absolutely no discrimination. So after the fact, you can't tell. So if you don't know source credibility when you first hear the information, you're never going to be able to tell whether it was true or not, and you're never going to be able to parse out in your head whether it's true or not. So, yikes. Confidence is often unrelated to accuracy or knowledge. It often corresponds to how familiar we are with information. And guess what? It makes all those motivational biases that I was just talking to you about before even tougher to shake. because I'm confident. So some quick things that are ideas for things that you can do to try to hopefully see what you can do about disagreements about what is good. One, look out for persuasive spin, of course. Just be ready. Consider alternative explanations. This is really big. Prioritize having a balanced perspective. The next one is the hardest one. De-silo. Play devil's advocate. And this is not hope the other guy plays devil's advocate because your view is probably the right one, which is the way I like to do it. But it's really play devil's advocate with your own point of view. And don't let confidence fool you, even if it's your own confidence. So, bottom line, try to be more open to possibilities while also being more thoughtful about things like source credibility and objectivity right away. This may not get us all to agree on what is good, but it may at least get us to a point where we can talk to one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schneider. That was a really interesting talk. I actually, even learned some new words I did not know were words, which is always cool. Really cool ideas. We're going to start out the Q&A section. So if anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand. Or if you don't have a microphone or anything like that, you can enter things in the chat as well, and I will call on people. Oh, I see a hand. Oh, wait, is that, oh, Jamie?
Jamie?
Hi, Dr. Schneider. First off, great job. I feel like I learned a lot, and
thanks.
For many of us, this can be so widely applied, especially right now. Thinking on confirmatory silos. Obviously, some of us are aware that, dependent on how we access and use media, that will create algorithms that feed into, what we are fed or what we see, how we search, like how we're prompted. Do you think the longer that, people do sit or continue to use these, forms or like not play devil's advocate or de-silo, does it make them less equipped to reframe or apply any of these other strategies to somewhat challenge or be able to, speak on the other half of what is good and what is not? Sorry, but we're.
Mm-hmm. So my answer would be the more this automated siloing happens, like we're all getting this automated, I'm just going to feed you what you like to know about. It is going to be harder and harder to de-silo. And let me just be clear, that's not a real vocabulary word. That one is just completely made up.
I like it.
But let me say, though, that one of the things that makes this really difficult is that it's comfortable to go with stuff that matches what we think. Who's motivated to get those icky feelings around, maybe my point of view isn't quite right, but I like my point of view. I'm happy where I am. And so it's very hard to get motivated to step outside of that. And so if we already have the devices that we're working with that are trying to feed us all of that stuff, it's going to be rough. I keep hoping that there's going to be some kind of technological breakthrough as this comes to a head where we feel like we're aware that we can't all have such different points of view and have no way to get back into communication. But I don't know exactly what that would be. So I'm holding out hope.
Thank you so much, and great job again.
Thank you.
See, it looks like we have a hand from Dr. Oh my goodness, Gavidon. Don't tell me I butchered that.
Gavidon, yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Sandy, that was a wonderful presentation. I just had a quick question about trust, especially related to the COVID study and that aspect. Did you consider looking at trust maybe in U.S. government or sources of information, like if that had a factor in any of this?
We did look, and again, it's all just correlational. So we did ask people the extent to which that they agreed with health experts who were cautioning against the dangers of COVID. And we also found those differences. I knew I was going to be 1 or 2 minutes over as it was, so I didn't include that slide. But but that's it. We didn't go much wider than that. So there's definitely a lot to be done. But I would be surprised if it does not extend into trust beyond that. And by the way, I didn't do trust. We did agreement with, which could be different.
Right.
But if you disagree, I guess that means you don't trust what they have to say.
True.
It's a stretch, though. Trust is actually a huge and fascinating issue as well. So I have only dabbled in it in the past, but I think that there's a much bigger world, even beyond this business of just the localized, here's what I think, here's what you think, but the social trust-related issues are huge.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other questions or even comments while we have a couple minutes before Dr. Verona's talk? I mean, I guess I can have have a question, Dr. Schneider. When you were doing this, did anything you found really surprise you, or kind of, I don't know, anything you thought you would find that you didn't, or I don't know?
So one thing that surprises me a little is that, and I don't know, you guys can, maybe you can tell me that, nah, I should have expected that, is that the degree to which people who are clearly in the Republican camp feel that Fox is their go-to news source and are not all that willing to seek out others. And I either could be not so much surprised by that if I saw the opposite on the liberal side too. But it isn't for those people that say, I am a very committed conservative Republican, Fox is the news station almost unanimously. For people who say, I am a very convinced, for sure liberal, it's not quite as clear. And part of it, I think, is because there's more stations that have liberal leanings to them, perhaps. So the CNNs, MSNs, et cetera. But I guess I think there may be a bit of an asymmetry in the information gathering. So, and I don't know if that's an especially interesting surprise. What disappoints me the most, I think, is probably the really astounding disconnect between confidence and knowledge. So, and the truth is I shouldn't be. I've been studying it for years. The first time I found that disconnect in my own research was in the late 80s, early 90s. These are in the 1900s, guys, before but still, it surprises me.
Oh, we have another hand, I think. Jamie?
Yeah, it's me again. On that, your research on that confidence knowledge disconnect, I was thinking as you were presenting how you had found your subsets for where all your participants leaned in their news sources and how they identified. Have you considered any kind of follow-up research to target maybe groups who already identify as, oh, I lean to Fox for my news, I lean to either for my news, and then I leave to liberal media, measuring each subset's confidence knowledge disconnect. If one group may be more confident, I don't know how easy or hard that may be, but I was curious if you've thought of that.
So that might be an interesting thing to do. I am not sure that I will do it. The only reason is I have done that and I have seen so many other researchers do it across so many other groups that it's just shocking. And here's the real thing. It has less to do, like I said, with the fact that you just have people who don't know what they're talking about being wildly overconfident, even though that happens. But it's that none of us really know how confident we are, and we all assume we're somewhere in the middle of the pack. And so there might be a little bit of an uptick where the people who really do know a little bit more are a little more confident than the people who really know next to nothing. But that's really what it is. People can't discriminate. You just really can't discriminate. And so I think it's more a fundamental inability to be able to really gauge where you are, either relative to everybody else or even sometimes relative to how you've done before. So, and it does turn out that practice in a particular area multiple times will get you better in terms of your confidence, accuracy, connection. But it's one of those things, just like any kind of skill, you really have to develop it.
Okay. Thank you.
But let me also say, can I say, oh, I'm sorry, I know time's up. I did want to say, though, if you do want to try and get people together, I think you might have been onto something by saying people who are at least open to a little bit of input from things that might not be their most consistent source. I think that group might be the best group to start working with to at least start getting these conversations going about how we can open things up. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we ran a little over, but those were some really good, things to think about. Awesome questions. Okay, so we're going to move on. Thank you, Dr. Schneider. We're going to move on to Dr. Verona's presentation. It's called Psychology, Gun Violence Prevention and Legislation. And I guess, Dr. Verona, are you on? Oh, perfect. Here we go. Yes. Here is Dr. Edelyn Verona.
You're muted, Edelyn, just so you know.
Okay, I can't unmute myself and show the presentation at the same time. All right, I'll try it again. All right, so today I will be talking less about sort of an area of research, which I really enjoyed the last two talks. It was really interesting. And more talk about sort of the landscape of gun violence prevention and work on this area and how psychology can better intersect in improving improving public safety, really, of which gun violence plays a big role. So just for those of you who may not be clear on this, gun violence is a really important topic because of the toll that it takes in our society. And it does seem to have sort of, it does have some US specific foundations to it. So in this country, about 100 Americans are killed with guns every day. There are about almost 40,000 deaths from guns each year. That's about a 12.2 out of 100,000 rate of death due to firearms. And there's also on top of that another 115,000 that are injured from firearms each year. So that's why gun violence is everyone's problem. As I noted, Americans tend to see a lot more gun problems and gun violence in this country, especially gun homicides, relative to other considered first world nations that have relatively lower rates. And then in terms of the average cost per year, gun violence is somewhere in between the cost of obesity and Medicaid spending. So it takes quite a toll on our country. This is just kind of a kind of overall outlook of homicides by weapon type across from 1976 to 2004 here on the left. And what you see, there was this big rise in violence more generally, in violent crime during the 80s and 90s, that then went down. But one thing that's clear is that most homicides are committed by handguns in particular. Even other guns are much lower in terms of the toll they take on lives. And then on the right side, you see this this comparison of deaths by motor vehicle traffic events versus firearms. And what you see is that we have gotten a lot better in protecting people's lives in automobile accidents, but not so much the case in firearm deaths. So that's remained fairly stable across time despite advances in technology. The other piece that I think is important for this talk is that, as I noted, there was like this big increase in violent crime across the 80s and 90s. That has really gone down quite a bit since then. If you continue the graph on the right further to now, you'll see kind of a decline and then sort of a plateauing at fairly low rates of violent crime at this moment. However, what you see is that there's still quite a bit of fear amongst people, and people's perceptions, and this goes back to Sandy's point, people's perceptions of crime and fear of crime and their vulnerability to crime is much higher than what the actual crime rate is. And I think, you know, this plays a role in our society in terms of the extent to which people choose to purchase firearms. So what about the regulation of firearms? So a lot of the arguments are about the Second Amendment, right? The Second Amendment gives us a right to bear arms. And so typical constitutional argument that you hear from people when you talk about sort of, we've got to do something, right? We've got to do something about this. There's got to be more regulation. This is a typical argument, and it was in a magazine article. In well-developed countries such as Australia and Japan, strict gun control laws are effective at reducing the amount of yearly deaths. Although the United States is well-developed, its gun control laws are too loose to be effective, forever handicapped from complete effectiveness due to the Second Amendment. So there's always this argument like, hey, we can't do anything. There's, my two dogs are fighting, so I apologize for any background noise. So the argument is because we have a constitution and there's this Bill of Rights and the Second Amendment, there's very little we can do. And the response I would give is that that's not the case. Partly, if you look at the most recent, one of the most recent cases that went to the Supreme Court that challenged regulation of firearms, unfortunately, it did overturn 2 centuries of precedent by interpreting the Second Amendment as guaranteeing an individual's right to keep and bear arms, not only connected to state-sponsored militia or military. So what they did is, in District of Columbia versus Heller, the U.S. Supreme Court said basically, hey, you can, basically it's a right of the individual to keep and bear arms, and you can't limit that to much of an extent. Whereas previous courts have said, there really isn't an individual right. However, despite that, that same decision also concluded, and this was Scalia, who was one of the most conservative judges on the court at the time. He also added, although we do not undertake an exhaustive historical analysis today of the full scope of the Second Amendment, nothing in our opinion should be taken to cast doubt on long-standing prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, or laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places such as schools and government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms. So basically, even in this decision that a lot of gun control activists felt was really, a punch in the gut, even here it's made clear that the regulation of firearms is not prohibited. And the other piece that I think is important is that there's, depending on how you ask this in surveys, if you ask it in an objective way, across the political spectrum, there is support for a lot of gun regulation policies, including among gun owners, including among NRA members that support something like universal background checks for all gun sales, which we currently don't have. So what is the role of psychology? And I feel like psychology hasn't played as much of a role as we could in this, what I consider an epidemic of gun violence. A lot of the macro level disciplines that understandably have tended to dominate research and action on this topic. So epidemiology, of course, in public health, it is a topic of major interest, sociology, criminology, and more recently, even emergency medicine has taken up this topic because of, kind of working on advances to helping gun wound, how to heal gun wounds and how to address and triage those injuries as they come into the emergency room. So psychology, I think, has a role to play, and it can play it at a larger scale. One thing that we can do is around education, and especially around this idea that mental illness and violence risk come together. And after a lot of mass shootings, you hear this quite a bit, right? Oh, the person was mentally ill, or you have to be violent. You have to be mentally ill to kill people that you don't know, that sort of thing. And what we can conclude about the role of mental illness and violence does depend on how we define mental illness. Again, if we define it as, if you kill someone, you must be mentally ill, yeah, then there's a connection. But how we typically define mental illness in terms of diagnostic symptoms, and so people who have such diagnosis do not tend to have high rates of violence. So actually, people with mental illness make up a small percent of the perpetrators of gun violence. They're actually much more likely to be victims than perpetrators. However, our laws in terms of background checks use mental illness and involuntary hospitalizations as a restriction on gun purchases. And although we can agree or disagree on whether that's correct, it's likely to be ineffective at reducing gun violence, given that persons with mental illness are not at high risk of gun violence. So who are most at risk, and when it comes to using guns, are people who are high on suicide risk. So when I gave you the statistics about 30 to 40,000 people who are killed by guns, the majority of them, sometimes over half, are victims of suicide, not homicide. So guns are used quite often to kill as a method of suicide. And so that's one concern we have when we look at how firearm regulation intersects with issues of mental health. And so you'll see that 22,000 people die every year from suicide. At least this was in the years 2013 to 2017, a lot fewer from homicide. And even after there was a decline in homicides and gun-related homicides, after the 90s, the suicide rate continues kind of quite stable and high, although, and it might actually be showing somewhat of an increase. So this is something that we need to talk people about. Here's kind of a statistic you probably have heard in a lot of your psychology classes. Females are 3 times more likely to attempt suicide, whereas males are 3.5 times more likely to die by suicide. And why is that? Because of the method they use. Men are more likely to use firearms. Women are more likely to use other methods. And what happens when you use firearms to attempt suicide? You're much more likely to die. And actually, suicide attempts by gun, 90% end in death. Suicide attempts by all other methods, over 90% of victims survive. And so this is something that I think a lot of people don't know about when they mention mental illness or mental health problems and the impact on gun violence. And by the way, I consider suicide by guns as gun violence too. And access matters. So household gun access triples the risk of death by suicide. Again, why? Because if a gun is available, they're much more likely to die. More than 1 in 3 U.S. children live in a gun-owning household, and only half of those households report that all their firearms are locked. This, again, as a psychologist who's working with perhaps children who have mental health problems, that's something important to work with families around. And then research shows that geographic variations in suicide rates is due to the availability of firearms, not differences in mental health, right? People will tell you, you know, mental health problems are really high in Europe, right? Or in other countries, but they don't have the number of gun suicides that we have. All right, another area that besides education is intervention, where psychologists can play a large role, especially clinical psychologists, counseling psychologists. There's a lot of trauma around firearm deaths and injuries. So there's a lot of gun violence survivors, as I mentioned. There's over 100,000 gun violence survivors who have been injured by guns. And 58% of persons surveyed in 2018 reported witnessing an act of gun violence, being threatened or wounded, or having someone they know or care for wounded or killed. So it's a common problem. And so as a psychologist, you may be called to deal with this type of trauma, and it's important to have some knowledge on that. Also, kind of death of family members or loved ones can also be something that you deal with a client. And then as we mentioned, suicide and violence risk. So persons who have access to firearms are more likely to hurt other people or hurt themselves. And so as a psychologist, if you have a client with those problems, then that means you have to attend to their access, and means restriction, which means trying to make sure that they're not accessing these firearms, is an important thing to deal with. And then research. This is where I think we can do a lot more in. There's a role for psychology research in understanding motives for gun carrying. Like I mentioned, how people have this belief that they're less safe than they really are. So we need better theorizing and assessment of why people carry. Do they have higher perceptions of threat, a need for control, prejudices or bias? We need improved risk assessment. Like I mentioned, a lot of our risk assessment sometimes doesn't ask about guns in the home. The psychological impact on survivors of gun violence versus other types of trauma might be an important information that we can gather. There's a need for sophisticated analytical approaches given the panel data that's often involved. And then also studying factors that influence or change public opinion or views on the topic, so that we can have more traction on making changes in society. Sweetie, I'm on the call. Can you stop my tutoring? No. But it's not helping at all. Okay, I'm gonna talk later. Okay. Sorry. And then one area that I think is really understudied is the area of intimate partner violence and firearms. A lot of research, psychology researchers do research on intimate partner violence. And I think we might do research looking at how alcohol use and alcohol accessibility can impact violence in relationships, but rarely do we investigate weapons access and use. So in an average year in this country, over 600 women are shot to death by an intimate partner and many more are injured. And research shows that, again, access to a gun in a domestic violence situation makes it 5 times more likely that a woman will be killed. And threats by guns predict likelihood of intimate partner homicide. So working with intimate partner survivors is important in asking them these questions that may increase their risk. And then finally, advocacy is a point. This is something that I've done a lot around firearm prevention, violence prevention. That I think there has been for time a feeling of resignation or feeling like giving up, and some of these comments that you see, some of these memes sort of advance that view. So one that's very common is, in retrospect, Sandy Hook marked the end of the U.S. gun control debate. Once America decided killing children was bearable, it was over. And then John Oliver, who I love, did say, one failed attempt at a shoe bomb and we all have to take our shoes off at the airport. 31 school shootings since Columbine and no change in the regulation of guns. Now, that's not completely true. There hasn't been much change at the federal level, but state by state, there have been a lot of gun reform that's been done. And our psychology training, I think, is useful in efforts to influence policy change. And I think we have a particular set of skills that we can use in this domain, right? So we have good skills in interpreting research and survey results so that then we can translate those into policy change. We're taught to clearly communicate the research to a broader audience. Our knowledge of mental health and the psychological impact of, of the trauma of having access to firearms, that's an important area that we know about that can inform the public. And then we have legitimacy in reducing the misinformation on the role of mental illness in gun violence. So one of the things I wanted to bring out in this talk is just sort of encouraging psychology to play a larger role in this issue and discussing it more, and showing how psychology training, has an important role to play in making us ready to kind of deal with this issue more directly. Is that all the time, or when do I go to?
If you have more to say, feel free. Got some time.
Just a few more things. One is, I wanted to just give you a landscape of what happens at our state. Like I said, there's not a lot of movement that happens at the federal level. There's a lot of gridlock there around the issue of gun regulation. And by the way, I prefer, again, based on data on how you frame the issues, I don't use the word gun control. We tend to use the word gun regulation or gun safety or gun sense, just because gun control, people have sort of this knee-jerk reaction to it. So that's just something to mention. That's why I use those other terms. But in Florida is a very active, has an active legislature in terms of gun-related bills. Most of them are things that I find to be pretty dangerous. Almost every legislative session, there are bills come up that to allow guns in courthouses, guns in private schools with religious institutions, guns in religious institutions with schools. There's been bills to make businesses that post no gun signs liable if somebody is killed or injured in their business because they weren't carrying their gun. There's a lot of open carry laws. So luckily, Florida is not an open carry state. We can't just like, hang a handgun around or a long gun on our shoulder and walk around with it. We're a closed carry state, but there's a lot of open carry states. So, but a lot of legislators have tried to make us an open carry state, permitless carry state. So meaning you don't need a permit to carry. And then we have a lot of background check loopholes, even more than the gaping loopholes we have available in most of our background checks. So these have been defeated, but you sort of have to fight the same battle over and over again because they keep coming up. And a lot of these bills are actually written by NRA lobbyists. So something shifted in Florida after 2018, in 2018 because of the Parkland, Marjory Stoneman Douglas shootings in that high school. For the first time in decades, a lot of gun safety bills, instead of more like gun lax laws, were put into place. So we had red flags law, which are temporary protection orders that basically say if you're at risk of hurting yourself or others, the police can take away your guns, at least temporarily. So those have been really effective in many states in reducing especially suicides. So the data so far suggests that they really help in reducing suicides for obvious reasons. Like I said, means restriction. This law also increased the minimum age for purchasing rifles to 21. It banned bump stocks. It prohibited individuals with certain mental illnesses or commitments from purchasing guns. Like I said, probably not super effective. And then it provided a 3-day waiting period for all guns purchased from licensed dealers. Now, note that there's a lot of unlicensed dealers, and so a lot of guns are bought and sold from people who don't have to do background checks on people who buy their guns. The one thing that was in it that was a little bit more concerning was that it included this Guardian program, which basically said that every school needed to have sort of a gun carrying officer there to protect the children. And then Stand Your Ground, I just wanted to bring it up because it has a lot of implications across the board for a lot of things, and has been in the news quite a bit, and it tends to be sort of the Florida gun bill that gets talked about a lot. So Stand Your Ground was first passed in 2005, and then in 2017 they expanded it even more. So Stand Your Ground expands the castle doctrine. Basically, like when you're in your home, if somebody comes in, you can shoot them. You don't have an obligation to retreat because it's your own home, right? It expands it so that basically the castle doctrine, your castle is carried with you everywhere. So basically, you're not obligated to retreat and can use extreme force if you feel threatened, even if it's outside your home. And the expansion of this law, which was 2017, shifts the burden of proof to the prosecution in a pretrial hearing. And if the judge finds that the fear was reasonable, the defendant escapes arrest and prosecution. So these are some of the laws that have been passed in Florida that we as voters have kind of a say in the future in terms of voting for folks that may be able to protect us a bit better. That's all I'll have for now.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Verona. We really, really appreciate it. I will now open up this section of the panel to questions for Dr. Verona, if anyone has any. Dr. Schneider. Okay. See Dr. Schneider's hand is raised.
There you go. Okay. Edlin, so the very last thing, I was getting all ready to raise my hand and say, well, what does this mean about the stand your ground law? I just find that so baffling, the expansion in particular, that they would make it the prosecution's job to say that the other person had no reason to be fearful. And I just think it's such a ridiculous, personally. Now, maybe if I were more open-minded and I saw more information, I would feel differently. But well, do you have anything to say about what are the odds that there's going to be broader thinking on, what does this really mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's kind of like you said about, we don't know the cause and effect. This is correlational, but we do know that since passing of the 2005 law, there has been quite an increase in homicides in the U.S. In Florida, in specific because of that. And the question is, does the law sort of provide sort of this cultural sort of high five, for you to use extreme force and not have to retreat, right? And saying basically, we live in the Wild West sort of thing, and we all have to protect ourselves. It increased, and especially with this idea that we have this kind of distorted view of our risk of being victims of crime. Mm-hmm. So if folks are sitting around already with this kind of fear and this feeling of threat, then it's based on their perceptions of threat that they can claim this, then wouldn't it make it more likely that they think of using a gun in most situations? And so that's sort of the concern we have. So, yeah.
I mean, I could just see being in a queue at a store and, having your back to somebody and getting shot and having to say, well, I couldn't see what you were holding. You had your back to me, so I was afraid. It's like,
yeah. I mean, so far, I think one of the things that has protected us is that I think judges are mindful of this problem, and most of these laws, by the way, the expansion in particular was basically all prosecutors and sheriffs tried to defeat it because of the concerns they have in terms of their job. I mean, prosecutors especially, right? Because they have to basically try the case twice. Right. Once at pretrial hearing, and if you're lucky enough to have a judge that says, that's not going to fly, then you have to try it again at the trial. So it was explicitly, so one of the things Florida also has, I think that people should know, is that we're often called the petri dish for these gun laws. So we sort of try them out. We're like the guinea pigs for them, and then they get implemented in other states. So after we passed Stand Your Ground, then a number of other states followed us. And that was the concern recently when they passed the bill that allowed teachers to be armed, is that if it happens here, now a bunch of other states have precedent to then implement those same things. So that, that's sort of the concern. And I think what I wanted to highlight is how important Florida is for this issue and legislation in this issue, and how important it is for all of us to be in tune with what's happening, because we tend to just focus on the federal level, and that's not where the action happens.
Thank you, Edlin.
Thank you, Dr. Schneider, for that question. Elisa, go ahead.
So in terms of red flag laws, were we the first state to implement those? Have other states followed suit?
There's a number of states. That's actually I think one of the success stories in this regulation. These red flag laws have really shown kind of very positive findings across the board, previous to after. And like I said, it tends to have more benefits for reducing suicides than homicides, probably because suicidality is much easier to kind of detect than sort of violence risk. So it's been I think 16 states might have it. And I think a lot of people don't know that it's available, right? For a lot of times it's family members or others can contact the law enforcement. If the law enforcement agrees with the risk, then they can remove the guns. Then it's temporary, right? It's just like when you are involuntarily hospitalized, where you come in front of a judge at a certain time, and then if you can prove that you're not a danger, then they give you back your weapons.
Great, thank you for that, Elisa. Valeria, go ahead.
Okay. So I saw that you mentioned earlier, it was around when you were talking about the background checks, and I think it was like you said about 70% of gun owners support background checks. And I want to know, what do you think the main, the opposition to getting background checks more, what do you think is the main opposition to it?
That's a really, really good question. So I think there's a couple of things. One, like Sandy's talk discussed, I think there's depends on what sources you listen to. I think that there's certain sources that that are saying that it's a slippery slope, right? That if everybody has to get background checks, then that means that next you're going to have to register your gun, and then the government is going to know every household that has a gun, and therefore when the tyrannical government comes into it takes over, then they will target these households that have guns in particular. So this is why I say it's a very American type of problem we have. And I was reading an article recently about sort of the pioneers and sort of Western expansion, and how it pretty much socialized folks towards this individualism and sort of taking care of oneself, and that's sort of embedded, and that got transferred even towards the East, that kind of mentality. And I think that's sort of the resistance to this idea that the government should know what I'm doing. I should be allowed to carry weapons in case that I have to protect myself and my family, and from my own government that may become tyrannical.
Yeah. Any more questions? Yeah, and just to make a comment to follow up on Valeria's question, speaking of that, the willingness for people to say want background checks for guns, but then the fact that things tend to change very slowly, very incrementally. I was wondering if that's an issue with, say how the arguments are framed, or if it's a question of semantics, the words that are used when the argument is presented, or, just things of that nature. It just reminded me of that. Even Dr. Puryear's talked to as well, about the words you might use when you're presenting, an argument or a side to something. It has an important effect on how people react to it. So Yeah. So.
That's exactly it. I think that's why I mentioned how I don't use the word gun control, because people kind of react to it in one way or another. And the other thing is you know, when people are asked, like gun owners are asked questions about gun regulations, if you ask in objective terms, then they're likely to agree with it. But if you ask in a more like, you know, how do you feel about you know, the government knowing who has a gun and who doesn't have a gun, that kind of thing, then you get very different answers.
Right. Okay, well, I think we are at just about time. I'm going to transition to the Diversity Committee for the closing statements, and we'll also provide some voting resources in the chat too as well. So go ahead, guys.
Great. Thank you so much to our three fantastic speakers. We really, really appreciate your involvement with this panel. We'd also like to thank each of you in attendance for joining us today. We hope that this event has been helpful and will not only inspire your efforts in civic engagement, but might also inspire some general or maybe research-related questions in your future endeavors. So yeah, like Marcus said, we'll leave you with some voting resources in the chat, which are objective tools that you can use to research voting related issues like constitutional amendments and candidates. Just note that some deadlines listed in the voter information guide, like the deadline to register to vote, have since passed. However, the resource does still contain lots of relevant information and tips like how to find your polling location and find your sample ballot online. And lastly, we also want to remind each of you that in these times that our work as citizens doesn't end with a vote in a particular election. Each of our voices has value, and we can all be part of the change that we hope to see in this world. And then lastly, for information on joining or collaborating with the Racial Justice Task Force or another subcommittee within the Psychology Student Diversity Committee, please email psychdiversity@usf.edu. Thank you again. Be safe, take care, and remember to cast an informed vote.
Thanks, everyone. Voting resources were